and then we have a first was maybe 2 rounds of the Q&A, depending on the number. Okay, Stephanie, you have. PowerPoint, please.
Greetings all, after lunch, and I guess we'll have to keep this exciting so that everybody doesn't fall asleep this hour. I'm going to start off today by looking at safeguards in general, but looking at the implication of the ADB's review of its own safeguard policy, but as well as the World Bank and its safeguard review, and implications for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The ADB has an independent evaluation department of the sort that we all are hoping the Asian Infrastructure Bank will end up having, which is an independent analytical body and reports directly to the board. The IED found, first of all, why do we need safeguards? Safeguards are there to shield against what they call collateral damage to communities and the environment that projects can cause. And that, according to the IED, without this, roads can hurt habitats, dams can displace communities, and urban renewal and other projects can damage livelihoods. The reason safeguards are needed is because according to the IED, public and private investors do not automatically and voluntarily mitigate, and I would say avoid, damages that result from their actions. And the ADB's IED makes a very clear case for the reason to have safeguard regulations and compliance with them on one hand, as well as improvements in their implementation on the other as the two main pillars. So today, throughout this panel, we're going to be talking about two themes. The first theme is the necessity for, frankly, all multilateral banks to have strong mandatory safeguard requirements that are fulfilled prior to in disbursement, and the necessity of proper monitoring and implementation of these safeguards. Well, we're here in Asia, the Asian Development Bank. Why have safeguards in Asia? According to the ADB's own IED, there's been a tremendous, in Asia, the push for high economic growth has taken a huge toll on the environment. And so in Asia, this is especially important. The Asian Development Bank has long been known for supporting projects, a wide range of projects, including in the energy, transportation, water, and natural resource sectors, which have had substantial negative impacts on local communities and the environment. And we'll have our speakers speaking directly about this later. Safeguards are important because communities that are likely to be harmed by ADB projects have at times been able to use these safeguards to lessen the harm to themselves, to seek redress, or to prevent future negative impacts by, among other things, forcing the ADB to adhere to its own social and environmental policies. The importance of implementation of these policies cannot be understated. A number of the ADB's environmental and social safeguards are, at least on paper, significantly stronger than those of other multilateral development banks, and if they're implemented, can provide tools that communities can use to prevent or reduce potential harm. So one of the very important ADB safeguards is the right of local communities to make detailed comments 120 days prior to a project being approved before the board. This is of the utmost importance, and some of you may think, well, in this age of internet and Twitter and all that, why would anyone need 120 days to do an assessment? If you're a remote mountain community in Nepal without access to pre-earthquake, without access to telecommunications, it may very easily take that amount of time to obtain EIA documents, which are often very thick, to have them translated into a language that you can understand, to read them or somehow absorb them in societies where reading isn't necessarily a given, and then to discuss and formulate a response. So this 120-day window is of vital importance, and the ADB is one of the leading institutions that provides this. With these sorts of safeguards, inappropriate projects or projects where the damage, the risks to local communities and the environment are significant. They can be modified or canceled by the board because the board has the information prior to voting on the project. So the importance of the communities being able to provide input to the board prior to a board vote on a project is of vital importance. And if this is eliminated, then the number of troubled projects that lead to resettlement and that lead to environmental damage and greater expenses to borrowers, it will increase. The IED has found, and not only the IED, but also at the World Bank, the IEG, that post-disbursement monitoring of projects has long been problematic. There's always a will to do this monitoring, but the monitoring doesn't seem to happen as much as it should. And when it's done, it doesn't seem to be as thorough as it could be. There's quite a poor track record of this. Hence the need for upfront safeguards prior to disbursement, the way the ADB continues to pioneer. Unfortunately, the World Bank proposes now to sort of eliminate some of these protections, but the ADB has been providing a good example of the need for maintaining these protections. A very brief summary of some of the strengths of the ADB's safeguards on paper are, again, the 120-day mandatory disclosure period, the requirement that environmental assessments, which include social assessments, be conducted for all components of all projects, regardless of funding source. What this means also that the ADB must use its own high safeguards for any project that it's co-funding. So if the ADB joins with the Asian Infrastructure Bank, that means that the standards of 120-day consultation, all these other standards, must apply to that project. The ADB also has strict rules about financial intermediaries, where the bank itself must conduct due diligence for projects that are deemed likely to provide significant harm. On the other hand, in terms of labor protections, the ADB fails to clearly require the use of core labor standards throughout the project area, which is something that actually other banks have done better than the ADB. So we'll switch now. This is the background of the ADB. If we look at the World Bank now is undergoing its own safeguard review. And the president of the World Bank committed publicly that the bank would not dilute or weaken any of the World Bank's safeguard protections for vulnerable communities and the environment. Unfortunately, the draft of the new safeguards that was released this past summer proposes a devastating dilution, a devastating weakening of environmental and social protections. And I won't go into detail on all of these, but I'll name some of them. Okay, yeah, that's good. Weakening bank mechanisms for transparency, oversight, and accountability, eliminating mandatory time-bound requirements for safeguard implementation, eliminating the right of communities to obtain information and provide project assessments 120 days prior to the board vote, reducing access by affected communities to the inspection panel, reducing the ability of the inspection panel to function. Reducing the due diligence currently required under the bank's country system safeguard, and I think some of our speakers will talk about country systems. I think all of us that work in development strongly support the strengthening and robust use of national country systems. The World Bank and the ADB currently require very clear equivalency. If you're going to use country systems, and those should be as strong as the protection provided from the bank. The World Bank is now proposing on eliminating those detailed requirements, weakening protections for those who are forcibly displaced by bank projects, and making safeguards for indigenous peoples optional. Weakening biodiversity protections, and removing clear safeguards for projects which have high risks or substantial risk, actually, projects that are considered to have substantial risk of impact. Also, they propose weakening safeguards for opaque financial intermediaries, which are now increasingly being used to fund infrastructure development. Next, please. Okay, and so basically, the World Bank is proposing a massive dilution of its own policies with the counterbalance of promises of more monitoring. So don't worry, we're going to dilute the policies, but we're going to do much more monitoring. However, the track record of monitoring is very poor in both the World Bank and the ADB. And also there's no budget allocated for monitoring, so there's no dollar amount, no one knows how this will be paid for. If we look at the World Bank's independent evaluation group and the ADB independent evaluation group, the ADB finds that, again, the post-disbursement monitoring is truly problematic. And even the World World Bank vice presidents have raised the alarm that this new plan could create more problem projects, set a bad precedent, and lower more standards. The ADB's evaluation department identified serious gaps, and others on the panel will speak about this very detailed research done by the IED on implementation and supervision at the ADB. This is similar to what's been found at the World Bank. The IED also raises substantial concerns, not only about the supervision of high-risk projects, but about projects that are being labeled as not having a high risk, so they might be in a category B type of program. Next, please. The IED from the Asian Development Bank also urged strengthening of country system safeguards. So in other words, before you're going to use country systems, you need to make sure that they are actually not only strong, but strongly implemented before you switch wholesale to the use of the country system. Next, please. And that there be legally binding requirements for social and environmental impacts in the use of country systems. So the IED here at the ADB concludes that you really do need mandatory safeguards or requirement-based safeguards such as that of the ADB, rather than switching to an aspirational set of safeguards as is currently being proposed at the World Bank. Now, we do have to say that the World Bank safeguards are not yet final, and there's a great deal of opposition to the current draft, and so we can't tell you where that will end. But the ADB's detailed research has clearly shown the need for these kind of mandatory safeguards. So one thing that's a concern for us is to what extent is this IED report being heeded by ADB management, and how is the ADB management implementing these very important findings? We'll look very quickly, to wrap this up, at the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which as of now has 57 founding members with a goal of $100 billion in registered capital, initiated by the Chinese government. Next, please. This bank will focus on the infrastructure sector, which is at a very high risk of unusually high impacts on communities and the environment, a high risk of forced resettlement and impoverishment. Chinese officials have insisted that the ADB will adopt the best practices of other international institutions. Next, please. The bank, according to its website, will be lean, clean, and green. And there'll be strong policies on governance, accountability, procurement, environmental and social frameworks. We don't know what frameworks means vis-a-vis safeguards, but that's what it says. So this is the last slide. Questions for the AIIB are, well, will it have an independent permanent board of directors? If you have constantly rotating board of directors, how is their institutional memory? How do they weigh in on how they understand? To learn about the safeguards is very complex. Once you finally learn about them, how do you implement them if you're switching in and out? Will there be an independent evaluation department like the IED, which reports directly to the board, not to management? Will there be a do no harm commitment? Will there be a 120-day notice, which the AIIB will have to have if they partner with the Asian Development Bank? What will the resettlement safeguards look like, given that resettlement is a major impact of infrastructure? What about indigenous peoples? What about gender safeguards, vulnerable peoples? What about access to information, agreements and accountability mechanisms, labor standards, public consultation processes, including free prior informed consent, financial intermediaries, and anti-corruption questions? So those are anti-corruption measures. Those are sort of the suite of issues that all of us that have been doing work on safeguards and hear from our colleagues are thinking about in terms of the coming landscape. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
A lot of issues in this 12 minutes presentation about not only ADB but also AID. So we will have, I think we have enough time to discuss all this. Okay, let's move straight to the next speaker. Corina, please.
I prefer to stand here so that I can look at the slides. My presentation is not just from some of the things that Stephanie already mentioned. I just try to say things more specifically in an infrastructure context. Let's step back for a moment. So what are safeguards? And I'm talking here about the World Bank basically as the most influential of the development banks. And its definition is that safeguards are minimum mandatory standards to avoid harm to communities and to the environment. So they are the minimum. If country systems, if borrower systems are better, then by all means let's use borrower systems. importantly, the implementation of these safeguards can be externally monitored. It can be monitored by the affected people, by civil society, by any one of us who would like to do this. This is a very important point. So this is a system that we have in place now. But what is being proposed for the future is something radically different from what we have now. If you look at the first draft of the World Bank's proposed environmental and social framework, we see that that the tendency is to move from mandatory safeguards to something that is aspirational. We will do it if we can, if the circumstances are, but if there are no clear requirements. There's an increasing reliance on borrower systems without spelling out the capacity and the enforcement capacity. At least there's no requirement as of now to do this thorough analysis beforehand. And then also importantly, the proposed new framework continues to exempt the ever-increasing sections of the bank's portfolio that are not covered by any kind of environmental or social policies. Those are all loans dedicated to, that are policy-based lending, and there are sectoral loans, and are the so-called program for results loans. These areas of the bank are actually increasing, but they are so far not covered by standards. This is a serious shortcoming, and it makes us think that, what is our work really about? 50% of all lending is not really covered. Part of what is being proposed is to invest less time and resources in the actual preparation of projects. The focus is to move from project preparation to implementation. Well, we all know that implementation has been a problem. The bank recognizes that implementation of its safeguard has been a problem. And the focus on implementation is very, very welcome. Only it cannot come at the cost of project preparation, because project preparation, the early phases of project design, of project identification in the first place, those are the critical stages where there has to be transparency, where there's the possibility for community input, and so we cannot skip this stage and just move to implementation as is currently proposed, but without actually saying what kind of resources in terms of staff and financial resources will be used to actually focus more on implementation. All these proposed changes coincide also with changes in the institutional strategy. The new institutional strategy is focused on undertaking many more high-risk projects, meaning what they call being less risk-averse, and to finance transformational projects that transform entire societies or regions or sectors or parts of countries. And if you look at high-risk and transformational projects, infrastructure is at the heart of it. And we all like infrastructure. There is no question about it. Clean water, access to clean water, to sanitation, to most of us want good transport, good communications. It's very clear. But we have to clarify what kind of infrastructure we're talking about. And what we're hearing so far is a different kind of infrastructure. The examples that we hear about are, huge, gigantic transport corridors, mining, oil and gas extraction, large, multi-purpose dams. And we're talking about mega projects, we're talking about giga projects, we're talking about tetra projects, we're talking about hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of loans for this type of infrastructure development. The group of 20, the G20, actually created a high-level panel on infrastructure, which included representatives of both the private sector and of governments. And their main task was to ensure a strong and sustainable supply of bankable projects. And it's precisely these kind of projects, transport corridors and extractive industries, that the focus is on. In November last year, the G20 summit led to a meeting of the minds between the World Bank Group, the Asian Development Bank, other multilateral development banks, and the IMF to join their synergies to fund large-scale infrastructure. And for the purpose, the World Bank had established the Singapore-based Global Infrastructure Facility just a month before then. This is an effort to be led by the World Bank. The idea is to crowd in, private sector funding, because in the public sector, those trillions that we're talking about are not available. And as we heard yesterday at a big event on infrastructure here, the role of the multilateral development banks is being described as one of creating the enabling environment. Basically helping governments set up the laws and regulations to attract and to protect private investors. A focus on public-private partnerships. So basically, a provision of public guarantees and other risk mitigation products to the private sector. And it is in this context that safeguards are more important now than ever, because without safeguards, who will address the social, environmental, and even economic impacts of these large-scale investments? Because they do have a dark side. This dark side is environmental degradation, disruption of communities, massive displacement in some cases, deforestation, biodiversity loss, water pollution, you name it. And as usual, poor and vulnerable populations will be the ones that are going to be hit first. This dark side also shows how important it is that safeguards are not limited to the project per se, but that it has to go beyond the fence of the project. You have to look at entire sectors. You have to look at policy-based lending. So these areas need to be covered by safeguards. And this is not civil society that alone calling for this. This is, at least in the case of the World Bank, the independent evaluation group has very, very clearly stated safeguards must apply to all World Bank Group supported activities. This is the only way to get some coherence and cohesion and make everything work in the same direction. Otherwise, you might have different parts of an institution that work at cross purposes. A key component has to be the upfront, preparation of whatever the banks are financing. Because decisions on the side for infrastructure investments can profoundly affect the environmental and social impact. So this has to be public and transparent from the very, very beginning, and there have to be public debates about it. Really. To end, I would just like to point to general problems related to large-scale infrastructure projects. One thing is the so-called optimism bias, because what happens regularly is we underestimate the cost and we overestimate the benefits. This happens all the time, and the example I give is from the country where I am from originally. It's the Berlin-Brandenburg airport. The airport of the capital was supposed to open in 2010. Now we're in 2015. There is no date for opening this airport. It's massively delayed, and it cost many billions more than what was initially planned. And this is what happens to large-scale infrastructure projects, in many parts of the world. If you look at it, especially the African continent that I'm more familiar with, it's littered with the so-called, white elephants projects that were far too expensive and really didn't achieve the benefits they were meant to. Another issue related to this large-scale infrastructure development is that it is a magnet for fraud and abuse. And basically, this is also a worldwide phenomenon. Truly, even in Berlin, this has played a role, and it leads to the massive misallocation of public funds. And both local communities and societies as a whole will suffer the consequences of this for a long term into the future, because these large-scale infrastructure projects lock us in for 50 years, maybe more. So again, this is to stress, the importance of mandatory safeguards that, help address the questions of transparency and public participation early on. We can't really do without it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Especially, I was really struck by the Berlin airport project, supposed to be complete 15 years ago.
start off by saying that at ADB, safeguards are the cornerstone of our efforts to promote environmentally sustainable and inclusive growth. And this was, again, re-emphasized by the President only yesterday. He talked about how safeguards are an area where ADB feels add value in the region. And I want to emphasize that we have a robust safeguard policy framework. We have rigorous systems in place to deliver this, and we have capacity that we have put in place. We now have 108 safeguard specialists who is driving mainly in operations and increasingly in our resolutions, which is where the rubber meets the road. And I think the robustness of our safeguard policy and systems is confirmed by the report of our independent evaluation department, which stated this in very clear terms. And the report essentially says that our policy is practice, and we have systems in place. And I think I'm saying this not because I want to be complacent about it or brag about it, but I think it's important to recognize that we've come a long way over the last couple of decades in terms of a policy. And what we want to do is make sure that we continue to learn from civil society, from affected people and beneficiaries of our projects, but also from our clients and other multilateral development banks. Critical to all of this, of course, is that we and our borrowers need to ensure that we are vigilant to address problems as they arise in the context of our projects, because they will arise, and problems do arise in the context of infrastructure. And so really what we're talking about here is an ongoing process, one where you do need adaptive management, and you do need to take action during implementation. I wanted just to